This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today I am wrapping up the card-by-card portion of the set review for Alchemy Horizons Baldurs Gate. So far this week, we've looked at every card that isn't green or colorless, so that's what we're looking at today. There's still more content from this format to come, including an archetype guide and a top 10 about the biggest bombs in the format. I'll also be playing in the early access event on July 5th, and draft videos will also be going up on the channel in the near future. So in this video, I'm going to give you my thoughts on every green and colorless card in Alchemy Horizons Baldurs Gate and tell you how good I think they're going to be in the new limited format. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards. If you don't know what these letter grades mean, you should find an explanation in the description. All right, let's get started. First up, we've got Arcane Archery, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant. It says target creature gets +3/+3 engage reach and trample until end of turn, and you get a boon with, when you cast your next creature spell, that creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter, reach counter, and trample on it. The boon is a new mechanic in this set, and it's fairly self-explanatory. It tells you what it is. It's a thing that happens once, so, it's sort of like an emblem, in that it'll appear on the battlefield, but then when you fulfill the requirement, it goes away, and you get this bonus. So normally 3 mana combat tricks aren't great, even when they give a sizable boost and trample. 1 and 2 mana tricks are usually where you want to be. 3 mana is a lot, and it means you have less openings to use the trick while you can still add to your board, and it means you're also taking greater risk if things go awry. That said, this is a trick that can find you lethal damage out of nowhere, thanks to trample, and then it really pays you back. I mean, maybe it's not quite a full card that you get out of the boon here, but it's close. This seems like a pretty good combat trick in aggressive green decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Favored Enemy, which is a rare enchantment for 1 green mana. When it enters the battlefield, you note the most prevalent creature type in an opponent's library, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature you control fights up to 1 target creature you don't control, and then whenever a creature an opponent controls of the noted type dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So basically, this is an enchantment version of Prey Upon that also gives you some pretty real additional value. The teamer decks in the format will have a lot of creatures of the same type, dragons, and most decks will have enough cards with the same creature type that getting like 1 counter out of this is probably a reasonable expectation. Prey Upon on its own is usually a C. You do need large enough creatures to make it worth it, but that isn't asking a ton in green. I think this feels like a B- overall. It probably gets bumped up to a solid B when you're playing against one of the teamer decks that has like 7 or 8 dragons in it. Next up, it's Follow the Tracks, which for 2 generic and a green is a common sorcery, and it says conjure a card of your choice from Follow the Tracks spellbook onto the battlefield. Couple of things here. Conjure means that you get a card, but it's not one that actually exists like within your deck. It appears out of nowhere. It's sort of like a token, except that it can move between zones and remain a whole card. It can be shuffled into your library, it can go to your graveyard. And Spellbook means there's a selection of some number of cards that this card is looking at. And what they are the 5 gates in this set. Those are cards we're going to look at near the end of this video individually. Well, not individually, but we're going to look at them in the absence of Follow the Tracks. And by the way, you don't have to draft these for Follow the Tracks to do its thing. It's not like a lesson or something like that. You just get them out of nowhere. And the idea here is that you get one of these 5 gates, and obviously each of them is a color, so this basically ramps and fixes for you. The land does come into play tapped, but the upside the card has is that later in the game it can seek a non-land card, and that's some nice value to have on these lands. So yeah, this looks like pretty good fixing and ramp for green decks. Not adding to the board on turn 3 can sometimes be a liability, but I do think the effectiveness of this as a mana fixer makes it pretty nice. I'm giving it C+. Next up, it is Oya Minartok, Polar Werebear, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 4/5 legendary giant bear at rare, and it has hexproof if it hasn't dealt damage yet. When it deals combat damage to a player, you create a food token, and you can pay 1 blue mana and sacrifice a food, and you draft a card from its spellbook. When you do, add 3 blue mana, spend this mana only to cast blue creature spells. So what it means when it says draft is that you're going to see 3 of the cards that are from its spellbook of about 15 cards, and you get to choose one of them. And again, it's conjured. It's not a card that you have to have in your deck or in your sideboard or anything like that. It just shows up out of nowhere. And the spellbook, as you might imagine, is filled with blue creatures, many of which cost 3 or less. So when you draft one of them, you can actually just play it right away. Some of them are big, scary creatures. A bunch of them, are cheap, so you can cast them right away. One of the more powerful ones you can get that you can just cast right away is Kraken, for example. So yeah, this is strong. The whole hexproof part makes it hard for your opponent to find a way around it at first. Like, at worst, you're probably going to be able to trade this thing for a creature on the battlefield because your opponent won't be able to target it with removal until it damages something. And if you're in a situation where you can start cranking out food with this, you end up netting mana and cards, many of which you can just cast right away, like I said. One bummer is that there's not a lot of other food in the format, so you can't really turn him into a crazy engine. Like, if this card was an Eldraine, it would be even more powerful. I still think it's very, very good. It has good stats. It makes you food tokens, which itself is good, and then you can turn those food tokens into very real cards. The one thing is, obviously, you need to at least be splashing blue to take full advantage of this card. You can definitely play it in a deck that has no blue mana at all, because it's still a 4-mana 4/5 that makes food and has temporary hexproof. But it's probably not quite a bomb if you're playing it in a mono green deck. I think if you're playing it in a Simic deck, it is a bomb, and an A, it's just a crazy value engine. Next up, it's Verdant Rejuvenation, which for 6 generic and 2 green is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says seek X creature, enchantment, and or planeswalker cards where X is the highest mana value among creatures you control, and put those on the battlefield. So ramp does look like it might be a viable strategy in this format. We're going to see several cards in green that let you do it. The thing that concerns me about it a little bit is that there are a lot of really powerful 2-drops in this format, especially in red, so ramping might be a bit of a challenge when you're up against that. But if ramp is a real thing in this format, and casting this is something you can do, it's gonna win you the game most of the time. Now, you do seek, which means you get random creatures, enchantments, or planeswalkers. You don't know what they're gonna be, and then they get put into play. That doesn't mean you get to search for them. That would make it a lot better. And there is a chance you kind of get a dud here, but luckily you're going to get a permanent of some kind. And for the most part, they're going to be meaningful. Even if you just have a 4-power creature in play or a 4-mana creature in play, this probably wins you the game. So it's an interesting card. It's, 8 mana is a lot, and there are a lot of formats where you just can't rely on getting there. But my instinct is that there is enough ramp just in green that this is doable. It's really just going to depend on how aggressive the format shakes out. I feel like I want to give this a C+ for now, but this is a really weird card. It's one that could become, like, if ramp decks are real and you can draft them consistently, this is something you'll first pick sometimes. And if the format's really fast, it'll be an F. So it's really a card that is very interesting to think about for the format. Next up, it's You Line Up the Shot, which for 1 green mana is a common instant, and you get 3 options. One is that you conjure Plummet into your hand, the other is you conjure Naturalize into your hand, and the other is that you draw a card. Naturalize, of course, 1 and a green, destroy target artifact enchantment. Plummet, 1 generic and a green to destroy target flyer. So this is an interesting take on the crushing canopy type effect we see, but I think it's actually a little better than most of those. This is because instead of paying 3 up front, you get to choose to pay in installments, and more importantly, you can also just cycle this away when neither of those cards are useful for you, which is going to be a decent chunk of the time. Those are both very situational cards. It's still not something that's great, if it's maximum upside in a lot of situations is that you cycle it, it's not going to be that amazing. But I do like the flexibility. It's certainly playable. Probably gets cut a lot, but I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Ambitious Dragonborn, which for 3 generic and a green is a 0/0 Dragon Barbarian. At common, it enters the battlefield with X plus and +1 counter on it, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control and creature cards in your graveyard. It's nice that this checks the graveyard because effects like this that only look for a creature in play can sometimes be really bad. That said, it still isn't amazing to me. You need to at least have something with 4 power around for this to feel worthwhile, and that's not impossible to do, but it's not going to be easy to do by turn 4 either. Now, there is a lot of self-mill in this set within the green-black deck especially, and maybe that'll set this up more effectively. But the big payoff here, if you do set this up effectively, is still that it's just a big vanilla creature, and that's just not that exciting to me. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Ancient Bronze Dragon, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 7/7 Elder Dragon at Mythic Rare, and when it deals combat damage to a player, has flying too, but when it does combat damage to a player, you roll a d20. On Arena, this means a random number, 1 through 20, is produced, and then you get some effect related to that. In this case, you get X plus and +1 counters in each of up to 2 target creatures, where X is the result. So this is a huge efficient flyer that does amazing things when it hits your opponent, like most of the cards in this cycle. I do think the white and black dragons are generally the most powerful ones. I think this one comes in third. Those two can add to the board if you have no other board state, whereas Ancient Bronze Dragon needs you to have some board state to really be worth it. It can just put the counters on itself, of course, but it's better to put them on other things in case your opponent has removal. You know, all of that said, this is still a bomb. The format has ramp in it, so getting to 7 mana is more doable than it is in a lot of formats, especially in green. And, you know, if it hits your opponent, you're probably going to win the game. That means it's a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Band Together, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says up to 2 target creatures you control each deal damage equal to their power to another target creature. So this is a nice removal spell. We've seen cards that cost the same at instant speed and only let one creature do damage equal to their power to something, and those have been pretty good. Maybe not quite premium, but sort of knocking on the door. This lets you have 2 creatures do the damage, which is significant for 2 reasons. First, it means you can find more situations where this will function as removal. Second, it makes you less vulnerable to your opponent interacting, since now, even if they kill one of your creatures that's doing the damage, you can still do the damage. So sometimes you'll use this to have 2 smaller creatures team up to kill something big. Other times you'll want to target a couple of your things in case your opponent has removal, and you want to make sure you can still kill the creature. Overall, I think all of this makes this into premium removal. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Belt of Giant Strength, which for 1 generic and a green is a rare artifact equipment. The equipped creature has base power and toughness 10-10, and this has an equip cost of 10, but it costs X less to activate, where X is the power of the creature it targets. This doesn't seem that good to me. Obviously a 10-10 is huge, but to equip this efficiently, your creature already has to be kind of big, which also means that giving a base power and toughness boost isn't going to be as meaningful. You know, paying 6 mana to equip this to a 4/4 seems okay, but it's not that amazing overall to turn that thing into a 10-10. Obviously, if it already has an evasive ability and stuff like that, it gets better. And then you have diminishing returns. You know, putting this on a 7/7 for 3 mana, you know, +3/+3 is nice, but it's still, you're still paying a significant amount to equip this thing, and not for that impressive of a boost. It just seems really clunky to me overall. I think it's probably just a C-, and if I'm wrong about it, I think it'll be because I'm overrating it. Next up, it's Choose Your Weapon, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon instant, and you have 2 options. One is that you double target creature's power and toughness until end of turn, and the other is that it deals 5 damage to target creature with flying. This is a reprint, and it was fine. It's a pretty typical modal card in that both parts of the card are pretty underwhelming. The trick wouldn't be good enough on its own, and the flyer removal spell would be a sideboard card. You lump these 2 mediocre things together, and you end up with a playable card that will be able to do something meaningful in a decent number of situations, but oftentimes the thing it can do isn't that impressive either. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Circle of the Land Druid, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 gnome druid at common. When it enters the battlefield, you may mill 4 cards, and when it dies, you return a land from your graveyard to your hand. So this enables black-green decks in the format especially, and that's good because a 2-mana 1/1 that returns a land from your graveyard to your hand is not that good. It does mean that it's not bad to sacrifice to things because you end up breaking even on cards, but this probably needs a build-around grade. If you're in black-green, a color pair with lots of reasons to mill itself, it's probably a solid card. In other green decks, it's probably a D. Next up, it's Circle of the Moon Druid, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/4 human elf druid at common, and as long as it's your turn, it's a bear with base power and toughness 4/2. This was solid last time around. The 4/2 side is nice for getting something like Pack Tactics online, and being a 2/4 on defense is pretty good too. It gives you 2 nice but unexciting stat lines, but you get them at the optimal time for each of them. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Draconic Muralists, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/3 dragon bard at uncommon, and when it dies, you may search your library for a dragon card, reveal it, put into your hand, and then shuffle. This is really good. It's a 4-mana 4/3 that is a dragon that draws you a dragon from your deck when it dies, and there are a ton of dragons in this set. Some of them are bombs, so being able to search them up is extra good. It even has passable stats on top of that. A 4/3 is going to be able to generate a 2-for-1 pretty easily. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Dread Linorm, which for 6 generic and a green is a 7/6 snake dragon at common, and it can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or less, and it comes with an adventure. Creatures with adventures can be cast as spells, that then the card gets exiled, and then you can cast it as a creature later in the game. You do not have to cast the spell side of the card, the adventure side of the card, in order to cast it as a creature, though. So in this case, you get Scale Deflection, which for 3 generic and a green puts 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, and you untap it, and it gains hexproof until end of turn. Individually, I don't think either side of this card really blows you away. The trick is kind of expensive for what it does and situational, and the creature is big and only sort of hard to block. But when you put both on one card, you're kind of in business. The cards in Eldraine, the adventure cards in Eldraine that had combat tricks on one side, basically no matter how inefficient that combat trick was, all felt really good because you could fire off the trick early and kill an opposing creature, keep your creature alive, and then later in the game you got a whole card, and that means you're getting a 2-for-1. And that's what you're going to be able to do with this card a lot of the time. It can also protect your creature from removal out of nowhere, which is nice. I think the first copy of this looks quite good in green decks. It's also got a useful creature type. There's just a lot going on here that makes this a pretty attractive common. You know, going beyond that first copy isn't great, but I kind of like valuing that first copy at a B-. Next up, it's Druid of the Emerald Grove, which for 3 generic and a green is a 2/2 uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for up to 2 basic land cards and reveal them, and then you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, you put those cards into your hand and shuffle. If you roll a 10 through 19, you put one of those cards onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, then shuffle. And if you roll a 20, you put them both onto the battlefield tapped and shuffle. This is really good. A 4-mana 2/2 that always seeks up 2 basic lands and puts them in your hand is a card I would play all the time. I mean, you know, it's 2 lands, but you're still talking about a potential 3-for-1. So it makes sure you hit your land drops. Like if you're in a green deck and you play this on turn 4 and you don't have the lands you need to play your 6-drop, it makes sure that happens. It also fixes your mana. You get to search for lands of any basic land type. Well, just basic lands, actually. So that card would already be really good at fixing and everything. So the fact that sometimes it also ramps you, and in fact, more often than not, it will ramp you. It'll put one of those lands directly into play. When you roll a 10 through 20, you only put one into play, 10 through 19, obviously. But that's pretty impressive ramp to have on an uncommon that costs 4 mana. It's not quite Solemn Simulacrum, but I actually think that comparison is sort of fitting. Both are 4-mana 2/2s that get you 2 cards one way or another and can ramp you. I think this is an excellent uncommon. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Druidic Ritual, which for 2 generic and a green is a common sorcery. You may mill 3 cards and return up to 1 creature card and up to 1 land card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is another green card that does enable graveyard payoffs, and it also lets you return something to your hand, but that's really not amazing for a 3-mana sorcery. This is probably another build around because outside of the black-green deck, I don't really know why you would run this card. It gives you some card selection for an expensive cost if you're not actually getting any extra bonuses out of milling yourself. So you really need other reasons to load up the graveyard. And I don't even think it's that good in the black-green deck. I think it's probably a D in most decks in the format and a C- in black-green. Next up, we've got Earthquake Dragon, which for 14 generic and a green is a 10/10 elemental dragon at rare. It costs X less to cast, where X is the total mana value of dragons you control. It has flying and trample, and you can pay 2 generic and a green and sack a land or return it from your graveyard to your hand. So this set does have a lot of dragons in it, so reducing the cost of this is doable, but man, it really needs to have its cost lowered to be playable. You need like 7 mana value worth of dragons in play for this to be worth it. And sometimes you'll be able to play like 1 big dragon one turn and then the next turn play Earthquake Dragon, which will feel pretty good. But the payoff in the end that you get for setting this up, which itself won't be very easy, isn't that impressive. I mean, yes, it's a 10/10 flying trample. If your opponent doesn't deal with it, they're dead. But the creature still dies to a whole bunch of removal in this format. And sure, it can come back from your graveyard, but doing so makes you give up a land, which also makes it harder for you to cast this again. And I just have a hard time seeing situations where you're going to be able to get this to be cheap enough, regularly enough, for this to be very good in this limited format, even with dragon decks being a thing. I think it's probably just a D. Next up, it's Emerald Dragon, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 dragon. At uncommon, it's got flying and trample, and it has Dissonant Wave as its adventure. For 2 generic and a green, you can counter an activated or triggered ability from a non-creature source. This adventure creature is a bit disappointing, and that's because its adventure is so narrow. If it could hit creature sources, it would mean you could get rid of or counter Double Team. It would mean you could counter Specialize. And I don't think that would be that busted, but because it can hit creatures, there aren't that many things that you're actually going to be countering. Most of the time, you know, limited In Limited, creatures are the main thing you're playing, and they're the main things with activated abilities. There will be times where you actually have something to use this on, and the times where you do get to counter an activated or triggered ability with Dissonant Wave, and then you cast this dragon later, those are going to feel good, but I think a lot of the time, this is just going to be a 6-mana 4/4 flying and trample with minimal upside, and that's not a great card. I think this is probably just a C. Next up, it's Ettercap, which for 4 generic and a green is a 2/5 spider beast. At common, it's got reach, and it has an adventure called Web Shot, which for 2 generic and a green destroys a creature with flying. So it's always nice to have a main deck plummet effect that can also be a creature when you don't have a target for it. And, you know, like most of these common adventure creatures, neither side is special, but the fact that this can do both and sometimes generate a 2-for-1 makes this very solid. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Hill Giant Herdgor, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 7/6 giant. At common, when it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. This was a pretty key card in Forgotten Ruins. If you were in green and you were in a deck that wanted to sort of make the game go long, you really needed this to help you stabilize against the aggro decks, and it did a pretty good job between its massive size and life gain. It will likely fill a similar role in green decks in this format. We've seen a lot of big old green creatures lately that gain you life when they enter the battlefield, and they have been pretty nice in all the formats. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Inspiring Bard, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/3 elf bard. At common, when it enters the battlefield, you can give target creature +2/+2 until end of turn, or you can gain 3 life. So gaining life with this is something you do in the green-white deck, or if you really need to try to survive. Again, you know, if you're up against an aggro deck and they have some 3/3 you can trade with, and you can also gain 3 life, this can really help you get to that stage of the game. But most of the time, if you're not in the life gain deck, you're probably using the +2/+2 effect. And I kind of like this card, how they designed it in general, even in Forgotten Realms, because the +2/+2 is what you use when you're trying to be aggressive. When you are aggressive, and the gain 3 life is something you do when you're behind. So, you know, it's never an amazing card in either of those situations, but it's a useful card in both of those situations, and I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Jade Orb of Dragonkind, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon artifact. You can tap it to add green, and when you spend this mana to cast a dragon creature spell, it enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it and gains hexproof until your next turn. This is by far the best card in this cycle. A +1/+1 counter is no joke, and neither is hexproof until your next turn. It means your opponent won't be able to use sorcery speed removal on the dragon you cast with this. If they have an instant, they'll still be able to use it, but the dragon that you cast will at least be in their way during their turn, and there's not much they can do about it. I still don't love any of these because they're all 3 mana rocks that only produce 1 color and don't actually add to the board right away. But there are reasons to ramp in this format outside of dragons, especially in green. And the dragon upside here is something I like, but, you know, it's probably just a C still. Next up, it's Lurking Roper, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/5 horror. At uncommon, it doesn't untap during your untap step, and when you gain life, you untap it. This was nice in Forgotten Realms. Even if you aren't that good at gaining life, if you're in a more defensive deck, this could be a real roadblock because of its size. Obviously, it gets way better when you are gaining life because you sort of make it into a creature that can not only untap, but one that sort of has vigilance. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Monster Manual, which for 3 generic and a green is a rare artifact, and you can pay 1 generic and a green and tap it and put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery, and it has an adventure called Zoological Study, which for 2 generic and a green mills 5 cards, then returns a creature card milled this way to your hand. This does not look very good for Limited. The adventure is underpowered, and the actual artifact is clunky and frequently won't do anything meaningful. You know, you see a card like this and you're like, man, I could cheat something amazing into play. And that's true, but it's actually pretty hard to end up in situations in Limited where cheating a creature into play this way is worthwhile. You know, we're not playing Cube where there's these huge threats all over the place that you can cheat into play. We're playing a fairly typical Limited format where paying 2 mana to put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield just isn't that much more meaningful than just casting that creature, because the creature you're putting onto the battlefield isn't that impressive to begin with. And sure, I mean, the idea here is you could use Zoological Studies, mill yourself, put something in there that you want to cheat into play, and then use the effect. But it's also really annoying that you can only return a creature that you milled with Zoological Study, which makes it even more narrow. So it's going to be hard to, you know, spend a total of 9 mana on this card to return 1 creature from your graveyard, and then maybe you cheat it into play, but you're not really saving on mana at that point. I'm giving this an F. Next up, it's Owlbear, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 bird bear at common with trample. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. This was nice in Forgotten Realms. It's a nice common. It easily sets up a 2-for-1 because it has an enter the battlefield ability in reasonable size, and you even end up on boards where it can attack pretty effectively. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Owlbear Shepherd, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/4 Goblin Druid at uncommon, and at the beginning of your instep, if creatures you control have total power 8 or greater, draw a card. So if you have 2 Owlbears, you can start triggering this, which is a nice flavor touch. Anyway, this is a pretty nice green value engine type card, provided you can get enough power on the board. There is a lot of high power out there, and there are various reasons in green to try to get as much power as possible for things like pack tactics and other effects. So this is really on theme for the color in general. It's not really something sort of out of left field that this color doesn't support. It's something you're already going to be interested in doing. And so, if you draw 1 card with this, you're going to feel like you're doing it. And if you can keep drawing extra cards with it, it's going to just win you the game. Not all decks will be able to make it work. There are some color pairs that you could be pairing green with where it might be a little less impressive. But I think overall, this looks like a B-. Next up, I've got Poison the Blade, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant. Target creature gains Death Touch until end of turn and you draw a card. I'm never super high on this kind of trick. It makes any creature trade for anything, and then you draw a card, which is nice, but your creature that you use this on is usually also going to be dying in combat, so the advantage you get out of this becomes less impressive. I mean, it's definitely fine, but I don't play these in a lot of my decks. It's frequently like the 23rd card in my deck. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Prosperous Innkeeper, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 halfling citizen at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you make a treasure, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. This was pretty nice in Forgotten Realms, and I think it will be here too. Gaining the life is a big deal, especially in green-white, and the fact that it ramps and fixes for you is pretty nice. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Scaled Nurturer, which for 1 generic and a green is a 0/2 Dragon Druid at common. You can tap it for green, and when you spend this mana to cast a dragon creature spell, you gain 2 life. So even without the dragon upside, this would probably be like a C. Mana dorks are just really nice since you get to add to the board and pull ahead of your opponent in mana at the same time. I think the dragon upside is enough in a format where there are real dragon decks to get this to a C+. Next up, it's Split the Spoils, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery, and it says exile up to 5 target permanent cards from your graveyard and separate them into 2 piles. An opponent chooses one of those piles. Put that pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. This is like a green Factor Fiction, and I think it has a pretty cool design. It does take some significant setup that Factor Fiction, which is a very powerful card, doesn't need, and that is that you need 5 permanent cards in your graveyard to really take full advantage of this. But you're the one who gets to choose what 5 permanents go in which pile. Generally, you're really going to want to get the pile that has more cards, but your opponent's going to want to not give you the pile that has more cards, so it sort of creates a mini game where you could put like a medium creature and 2 lands in one pile, and then the other pile is like 2 medium creatures. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you're going to see a lot with this in Limited, and either pile is going to be good, and it's basically a very roundabout way to pay 3 mana to draw 2 cards, but they have to be from your graveyard. I don't know, this is hard to evaluate. There is the ability to load up the graveyard in green in this format, which makes this a little easier to set up. But it just seems like there are going to be times where you just don't have the setup for this. And then even when you do, I mean, you're never going to get your best card out of your graveyard. Although if you put your best card in one pile and 4 cards in the other one, I mean, you can end up in some interesting situations. This can definitely do stuff, but it does seem like it has a wild enough range that I don't love it. I want to start it at a C. It's really going to come down to how easy it is to load up your graveyard effectively enough with this to get full advantage. Next up, it's Sylvan Shepherd, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 human druid at common. It's got Vigilance, and when it attacks, you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, you gain 1 life. 10 through 19 gives you 2 life, and 20 gives you 5 life. This has passable stats, and it's a repeatable source of life gain, which green-white is interested in this format. It's probably a C. Next up, it's Traverse the Outlands, which for 4 generic and a green is a rare sorcery. You search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Put those cards onto the battlefield tapped and then shuffle. This can definitely ramp you in a big way. Getting 3 lands off of this is fairly doable. The question, though, is whether you'll have a need for so much mana in most limited games, and the answer is probably no. You won't have a big enough threat to ramp into most of the time. We have seen, a rare and a mythic that are pretty sweet to ramp into, but you need to get those for this to probably be worth it. It does fix you in addition to the ramp, but still, it's hard to imagine situations where you want to pay 5 mana to search up a few lands that you're probably not that desperate for. I think this is probably a D. Next up, it's Underseller Mykanid, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/2 fungus at common. When it enters the battlefield or dies, you make a 1/1 green sapling creature token, and it can tap to add 1 mana of any color. This is a very good common. And I think it's the kind of ramp card that actually gives green ramp decks in this format a chance against more aggressive decks, because in the end, you get 3 bodies out of this card and you only spend 3 mana. Sure, none of the bodies are impressive and the creature has to die for one of the bodies, but that's not a bad consolation prize. And if your opponent doesn't deal with it, it's fixing for you and ramping for you. I mean, a 3 mana 1/2 that makes a 1/1 sapling token when it enters the battlefield is probably like a C-. And this both also can tap for mana of any color, and it makes another body if it ever dies. I think this is a B- and one of green's best commons. Next up, it's Underdark Basilisk, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/2 Basilisk at common. It's got Death Touch. This was pretty nice in Forgotten Realms. It gets extra good alongside effects that let it damage things directly, like Band Together, because the Death Touch means it can take down anything. Outside of that, it's just a good card for deterring attacks on the ground early, since it can trade for many of your opponent's creatures. It also stays relevant all game long, as Death Touch often does. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Wild Shape, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon instant, and it says choose one. Until end of turn, target creature you control has that base power and toughness, becomes that creature type, and gains that ability. And your options are 1/3 Hexproof Turtle, 1/5 Reach Spider, and 3/3 Elephant with Trample. This was not very good in Forgotten Realms. It has a bunch of modes, but the only one that tends to matter is the hexproof one, and that effect is pretty darn narrow. It does feel good when you use it to blank removal. Sometimes you can out of nowhere turn your 1/1 into a 3/3 trample, or turn your whatever into a 1/5 reach to block an X1 flyer. Like, there's all these little situations that seems like might come up, but you'll be surprised how often this card just doesn't do anything, and that's usually not a great limited card, giving it a D. Next up, it's You Meet in a Tavern, which for 2 generic and 2 green is an uncommon sorcery, and you have 2 options. One is that you look at the top 5 cards of your library and reveal any number of creature cards from among them and put them in your hand, and you put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And the other is that your whole board gets +2/+2 until end of turn. This card ended up really disappointing in Forgotten Realms. Like, a 4 mana sorcery that doesn't always do something to the board is a problem. But I think it's probably going to be a little bit better here. You can draw multiple cards. Usually you're going to be able to draw at least 2 cards with the first option, and that option is the one you'll choose if you need more creatures. And if you're wide enough already, you can use the other one to do lethal, or at least, send a pretty impressive attack at your opponent. It's still clunky, it's still got problems, but I think it's probably a C. Playing one of these in creature-heavy green decks seems like a good idea. Next up, it's Yuan Ti Scale Shield, which for 2 generic and a green is a rare instant. It says permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible till end of turn. Seek a creature card if an opponent has cast a spell with mana value 3 or less this turn. This kind of effect always looks like it would be good, especially among less experienced players. Indestructible and hexproof are pretty amazing. I mean, what can possibly stop you? And yeah, there are situations where that can be good, but there are also lots of situations where it just doesn't do enough. Yes, you can list off a lot of situations where it does something, like if you're in combat and you can save several creatures and kill a few of theirs, or in response to removal, etc. And while that is a useful situation, for it to really be good in a situation where you use it in combat, your creatures need to also be killing some of their creatures, because if they're not, you're basically just paying 3 for a fog. And also using this in response to removal, while fine, is a pretty narrow use. Now, this does get interesting, because if your opponent has cast a spell with cheap enough mana value, you get to seek a creature card from your deck. And if you're doing that consistently with this, that does make this a playable effect, because you're effectively adding a cantrip to it. The problem is your opponent's not always going to have done that in a situation where you also want to be using this card in the first place. That's sort of the awkward tension here. It's almost like they added that other mode as sort of a cycling effect that you can use on your opponent's turn. as opposed to an effect that you'll get in addition to what this card already does. Because a lot of the time, it just won't do anything, because the time you're going to want to use this is when your opponent is casting removal. And if you use this to counter their removal, this resolves first before their spell ever does. And if you use it in combat, your opponent's also not very likely to have cast a spell on that turn. So it does have another mode, and there are situations where this can stop things from happening. But overall, I don't think it's very good. We've seen this effect for 2 mana before without the Seek upside, and it wasn't good in limited. 3 mana plus the Seek upside doesn't really change my mind very much. I'm giving this a D+. All right, so our last green cards are all creature cards with Specialize, a new mechanic in this format where you pay an amount of mana and you discard a card, and when you do, the color of that card or the type of land that card is results in your creature transforming into something of that same color. So we've got Jaheira Harper Emissary here, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/3 legendary human elf druid and uncommon. It has Specialize 2 and a hexproof from artifacts and enchantments. When you specialize with her, if you discard a green card or a forest, she naturalizes something and gains you 4 life when she specializes. And all of these are 3/4s, and all of them have a naturalize effect when they transform, and then an additional effect. So the white version naturalizes something, and you get to put a counter on each of up to 2 other target creatures. The blue one naturalizes something, and you scry 2. The black one naturalizes something, and your opponent loses 3 life. And the red one gives you a boon, naturalizes something, and gives you a boon that whenever you cast your next creature spell, it perpetually gets +1/+0 and haste. So a 2 mana 2/3 is already a nice 2-drop, and the hexproof from artifacts and enchantments doesn't come up a ton in this format, but it's not irrelevant. Then when she specializes, she naturalizes something, as we've seen, and you get an additional effect, and that's pretty nice. The thing that I like is that even if you don't have a thing to destroy when you specialize her, they all have effects that at least matter somewhat. I think in an ideal world, you always have a target to blow up when she specializes. Sometimes it won't be worth specializing her until she has a target, but she does get bigger and give you some sort of nice effect when she transforms. She's definitely not amazing. If this format had a bigger artifact or enchantment theme, she'd be better. As is, she's probably just a B-. Next up, we've got Lucamina Moon Druid, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/2 legendary human druid at Mythic Rare. You can specialize 3 with her, and you can only activate it if you control 6 or more lands. And when she enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you seek a land card with a basic land type. So when she specializes, she becomes a 4/4, and they all do wildly different things, so we're going to have to read them all. The green one in this case gives other creatures you control +1/+1 and trample. It has trample itself. And all of them do say, when it dies, it unspecializes and returns to the battlefield tapped, which means it comes back as Lucamina Moon Druid, which also will trigger the Enter the Battlefield ability to seek a land again. The white one adds lifelink to the mix. The blue one lets you tap down a non-land permanent an opponent controls, and it doesn't untap during its controller's untap step for as long as you control Lucamina. The black one has Death Touch and has to be blocked if able, and the red one has Menace, and it makes a 2/2 green wolf creature token when it specializes and when it attacks. So this is super strong. Her base form as a 3 mana 2/2 that gets you a basic land from your deck is quite good, even if you don't get to choose what land you get. That's sort of the downside here with Seek. You're going to get a random land from your deck, so you can't really look at her as fixing, but it does put a card into your hand, which also could allow you to specialize right away. And then once she specializes, she becomes a highly problematic creature. I especially think that the blue, green, and red ones are quite formidable, but they're all really, really good. The downside is, of course, she can't specialize until you have enough lands, but she helps you get to those lands. She kind of reminds me of the flip Nissa Planeswalker that had the same Into the Battlefield ability, was a Grey Ogre, and then would transform into something more powerful when you had enough lands, and also fetched you a land, and that's kind of what you have going on here. So the fail case here is a card that's probably like a C+, right? A 3 mana 2/2 that seeks a basic land. And the upside is that it transforms into something that not only is very problematic, but once she has transformed, removal will no longer deal with her entirely, because she'll return to the battlefield on her front side, get you another land, and then you can specialize again. You could even discard the land you sought. So I think she's a pretty huge bomb. I mean, her fail case is a pretty good card, and if she ever transforms even just once, your opponent probably can't win, giving her an A+. Next up, it's Skanos Dragon Vassal, which for 4 generic and a green is a 4/4 legendary dragon ranger. At uncommon, it has specialized 4, and when it attacks, another target attacking creature gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is Skanos' power. He's a little bit unusual in that when he transforms, he does not have the same stat line on every card. The green one's a 6/6, the white and blue ones are 4/4s, and the black and red ones are 5/5s. All of them gain a keyword ability, and they hold on to the ability to give something +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is Skanos' power. And they also give the creature that they pump the keyword ability they now have, or pretty much do. For example, the green one, like I said, it's a 6/6, so that means when it attacks, it gives something else +6/+0, has Vigilance, and it also untaps the creature that it targets with that ability. The white one has Lifelink, and it gives Lifelink and +X/+0. Blue one has Flying, and it gives Flying and +X/+0. Black one has Menace, and it gives +X/+0 and Menace. And the red one has First Strike, and it gives +X/+0 and First Strike. So the base card here is already pretty nice. A 5 mana 4/4 isn't great, but giving +4/+0 to another attacking creature is the kind of boost that can turn any creature into a threat. Then once it specializes, you get a nice keyword ability, and you can make those creatures into even more problematic threats. There's going to be a lot of boards where just transforming this and then attacking with it as a flyer and giving something else flying, for example, just ends the game on the spot. This is really good. I'm giving it a B. And our last green card and our last specialized card in this whole review is Wilson Bear Comrade, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 legendary bear warrior. At rare, it's got reach and trample. It has ward 2, and it has specialized 4. He's another one who has completely different stats depending on what it turns into. All of them are better stats. He also gets at least 1 keyword with every transformation, and then he has an effect he can use from the graveyard. So the green version gains trample, and it's a 5/5. And when it goes to your graveyard, after it does, you can exile it from your graveyard to give target creature you control perpetual +1/+1 reach, trample, and ward 2. The white one gains lifelink, and from the graveyard it can perpetually give something lifelink. The blue one still has reach, trample, and ward 2, but it also can't be blocked, and when you exile it from your graveyard, you can give a creature perpetually that it can't be blocked. The black one gains menace. You can give it menace, use it to give something menace from the graveyard. The red one gains double strike, and it's a 2/3, and it can give double strike to something when it exiles from the graveyard. So even if Wilson didn't have Specialize, he'd probably be a B-, as he's just a great French vanilla creature. Then once he transforms, he gets a lot scarier. And if he does die, he just gives powerful abilities to your creatures from the graveyard. I think he's a bomb. I'm giving him an A-. All right, we're moving into artifacts now. First up, there's Bag of Holding, which for 1 generic is an uncommon artifact. When you discard a card, you exile that card from your graveyard. You can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card, then discard. And you can pay 4 mana to tap it and return all cards exiled with it to their owner's hand. This is a cool design, but it hasn't been particularly good anytime we've seen it. Looting and then sort of holding onto your cards to get back later is nice, but having the 2 extra mana around to loot isn't something that really happens until the extreme late game. So a lot of the time, like in the early game, if this is in your opening hand, it almost feels like you've mulliganed, and that is not a good feeling. It does get better in the late game, but it's still not a card I love, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Basilisk Collar, which for 1 generic is an artifact equipment rare, and the equipped creature has Death Touch and Lifelink and equip 2. This has been great every time we've seen it. Those 2 keywords are great together, as making a creature capable of killing any other creature, while it also gains you life, is huge. It makes it hard for your opponent to successfully race you, while also making it challenging for them to attack. This is a B+. Next up, it's Bronze Walrus, which for 3 generic is a 2/2 artifact creature walrus at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 2, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. This is a pretty nice creature. It fixes your mana and ramps you, and even helps you improve your card draws. Outside of green, this format has a pretty big shortage of fixing when it comes to lands, especially. So artifacts like this are going to be extra sought after. There isn't a single dual land or evolving wilds-like effect in this format. We're going to see a bunch of artifacts that help you fix is sort of where they put it in this format, and this is one of them, and it's quite good. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Chartalin Dragon, which for 6 generic mana is a 4/4 artifact creature dragon at uncommon with flying. This is not a very good stat line. It has a useful creature type. You'll probably run one if you have a bunch of dragon payoffs and you're short on them, but most of the time you won't. It's a D+. Next up, it's Cloak of the Bat, which for 2 generic is an artifact equipment at common. The equipped creature has flying and haste, and it has an equip cost of 2. This sort of equipment always seems to overwhelm. It feels like flying and haste should be a big boon for your creatures to gain when you cast them, but the problem is, to take advantage of haste, your creature has to cost 2 mana less, at least, than your total mana, so you can equip this to get the haste right away. And flying, while sure, it can be nice, there comes a point in the game where your opponent's pretty likely to have a sizable enough flyer that your creature already has to be big enough, or this doesn't do anything. I'm just never impressed with this kind of equipment, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Fraying Line, which for 4 generic mana is a rare artifact, and get ready for this text box. When it enters the battlefield, you put a rope counter on target creature you control. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player may pay 2. If they do, they put a rope counter on a creature they control. Otherwise, exile Fraying Line in each creature without a rope counter on it, then remove all rope counters from all creatures. So the idea here is that the creatures you put rope counters on can survive the effect that this thing has, because ultimately if someone doesn't pay 2, everything gets exiled without a rope counter on it. So it's sort of a weird minigame-like effect where you and your opponent are both trying to pay 2 so that this doesn't trigger and kill their stuff. But the awkward thing is there are a lot of games, especially in the late game, where all this is really going to do is nothing. Like, you know, you and your opponent can both pay 2 every turn. It's not a big deal. Eventually, rope counters are on everything and it becomes meaningless. You know, it just seems like this has way too much going on to be that good. It seems like it would be better in like a commander format or whatever, you know, multiplayer commander format. I think it's probably just an F. It's just, you know, it basically, the turn you play it, your opponent has to pay 2 on their turn to put a rope counter on their thing. If for some reason they can't, then yeah, you save your creature and every other creature dies. It's like Dune Blast, but that's just not going to happen. It's just going to make both you and your opponent pay 2 all the time until eventually someone doesn't want to and they just want to blow everything up. And you just have too little control over how this goes for you for it to be worth playing, giving it an F. Next up, it's Iron Golem, which for 4 generic is a 5/3 artifact creature golem at common. It's got Vigilance, and it attacks or blocks each combat if able. So this obviously has decent stats, but it has a huge downside. It has to attack or block every combat. You end up in situations where the trades are super ugly for you, or worse, you can't even trade because they have like a 6/6, and that happens pretty often. It does have high power, which, as we've seen, green cares about, but it's probably still just a D. Next up, it's Lantern of Revealing, which for 3 generic is a common artifact that can tap to add 1 mana of any color. You can pay 4 generic and tap it and look at the top card of your library. If it's a land, you put it onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't put the card onto the battlefield, you may put it on the bottom of your library. So, solid source of fixing, I think. A 3-mana mana rock can definitely be clunky, but the fact that this has a pretty nice late-game ability, late-game mana sink, isn't too bad. It either will draw you a card and put it on the battlefield if it's a land, or let you scry 1, and both of those options for 4 mana, you know, aren't amazing, but it can really help you improve your draws in the late game. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Meteor Golem, which for 7 generic is an uncommon artifact creature golem. When it enters the battlefield, you destroy target non-land permanent opponent controls. It's a 3/3. 7's a lot of mana, but this comes down, has a significant body. It can blow up any non-land permanent. Not all decks want this as a 7-drop, but it does seem like ramping is pretty legitimate in this format, in which case you'll be pretty happy to play it. I think the first copy is pretty appealing in a lot of decks in the format. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Mirror of Life Trapping, which for 4 generic is a rare artifact. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, if it was cast, exile it, then return all other permanent cards exiled with Mirror of Life Trapping to the battlefield under their owner's control. This is kind of like Fraying Line. It just is way too wacky, and the fact it's symmetrical is weird. It feels like the kind of card intended for big multiplayer commander games, so it's weird. They printed it on an arena-only set. This can help you abuse into the battlefield abilities, I guess, but it will also do all sorts of wacky things you have no control over. I think it's an F. Next up, it's Navigation Orb, which for 3 generic is an uncommon artifact. You can pay 2 and tap it. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards and or gate cards. Reveal those cards, put one onto the battlefield tapped, and the other into your hand, then shuffle. So this is an okay source of fixing. It's like a 5 mana. You pay a total of 5 mana for Cultivate, and that's not awesome, but it is colorless, and if you're really interested in fixing, it can do it. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Pilgrim's Eye, which for 3 generic is a 1/1 artifact creature Thopter at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So this is a nice common. We've seen it before. It provides nice fixing while actually adding an at least somewhat relevant body to the board, and can even chip in for damage sometimes. It's also a nice card to blink over and over again, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Prophetic Prism, which for 2 generic is a common artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. And for 1 generic, you can also tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So mana filters don't tend to be great in Limited, but adding a cantrip to a card like this definitely makes me interested. The reason filters aren't good is because they significantly increase the cost of cards that aren't of a color of mana you already have. That's effectively what they do. They increase the cost by 1 mana, and that's a huge hurdle. We've seen this in the past in a few sets where it's actually been quite good, but that was because there was also a real artifact theme that we don't have here. In this format, it's probably just a passable source of fixing, one that you could also blink for value. I think it's a C-. And our last artifact is Spiked Pit Trap, which for 1 generic is a common artifact with flash. You can pay 5 and tap it and sacrifice it. You choose target creature and roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, it deals 5 to that creature, and a 10 through 20 deals 5 to that creature, and you get a treasure token. So this was not very good in Forgotten Realms. You spend a lot of mana for a mediocre removal spell, and even when you get the treasure back, it doesn't feel very good. It's a D+. We don't have a lot of lands to talk about, as I already alluded to. All we've got is this cycle of gates, which we already saw. They all only produce 1 color. They all enter the battlefield tapped, and they can all pay 3 generic and the color of mana they are to seek a non-land card. Obviously, them entering the battlefield tapped can be a pretty big liability, especially in the early game, but I think the upside of these is generally going to be worth it for 1 or 2 of them, because the fact that you can use them in the late game to seek a non-land card, which you can only do once, by the way, in the whole game, but that's a pretty powerful effect. You know, if a lot of times we have lands where in the late game you can sack them to draw a card, and that's always a perfectly good utility land. This is better because you hold on to the mana, and the card you draw won't be a land, which is probably good because if you have the time and mana to spend on this ability, you've got enough lands. They're definitely not amazing. You know, the downside is real, but the upside is enough that I think they're solid. I'm giving them a C. And our last card is Baldurs Gate, which is a rare legendary land gate. You can tap it for colorless, and you can pay 2 and tap it to add X mana of any 1 color, where X is the number of other gates you control. So this is the only gate payoff in the set, which is kind of a bummer, because if they'd had more of them, it would have been a little more interesting to have them in the set. And this one's not good at all. You need at least 3 gates to be netting mana, and even then you're only getting 1 mana. And the gates aren't so good in this set that I think you want that many of them. If this was Ravnica, where they all produce 2 colors and stuff, I might be on board, but this card mostly is just bad for your mana base, and I think you basically never end up in a deck with enough gates to make this work. Sadly, this card is the set's namesake, and it's an F. So that does it for the card-by-card portion of the set review. I'll be back tomorrow with an archetype guide where I talk about each of the color pairs and the synergies within them. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon or by becoming a YouTube member. Thanks for watching.